Hello and welcome to Fiction Fans, a podcast where we read books and other words too. I'm Lily.
And I'm Sarah.
And before we jump right into our exciting topic for this evening, Sarah, what's something great that happened lately?
So I don't know if I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I had a bird build a bird's nest essentially right outside my back door, which is lovely, except that it does mean that I can't exit out of my back door anymore.
Oh no.
Until the bird is gone. But my good thing for this week is not that. It's that the babies hatched.
Aww.
So there are little cheeping birds in the bird nest, which is actually kind of annoying. They're cheeping, but it's also very cute.
It can be both.
Yes.
I used the barbecue for the first time this year today.
Ooh, that is exciting.
It was too cold and windy to actually eat outside.
Okay, so baby steps.
Yeah, but I did use the barbecue. That's nice.
That was very nice.
Mm-hmm. Hopefully, I will be able to use it lots more in the near future. Really, I just want good weather.
Come down and visit me. You'll get good weather.
I know, it's far away though. Well, what are you drinking tonight?
In honor of our book tonight, I am drinking a dark and stormy because a dark and stormy night is what causes the events of the book.
Oh, that's very good and appropriate.
I thought so. What are you drinking tonight?
Through the magic of editing, no one will have to know that I completely forgot to prepare for this. Except I am honest because I have integrity. I just went and got a glass of wine.
As you should.
I'm also drinking out of a comically large water bottle, which only Sarah gets to enjoy, but it is bigger than my head.
It is quite large.
It's a step up from the empty milk jug I used to use as a water bottle, though.
I will grant you that.
Okay, so to answer your question, I'm drinking wine. As long as we're being honest, have I read any books lately? No, including the one for tonight.
That's okay. I did my homework.
This is actually one of the Discworld books that I've actually read multiple times, so I'm not too worried. Like, some of the books I've only read once and it was years ago, but at least for Night Watch, which is the book we're discussing today, I have a pretty good handle on it.
Yeah, for me, Night Watch, well, I reread Night Watch every year in May, have done so ever since Terry Pratchett died. So it's the book that I have read by far the most out of all of the Discworld novels.
Yeah, I'm not on that level.
Yeah.
I've just read it more than once. I'm guessing that that's also your answer for have you read anything good lately?
Yeah, as we've said, or will say, what are even our timelines? May is very busy with podcast reading, and so that's just about all that I'm doing.
But we picked good books for it, so it's fine.
It's true. I mean, all of the books that we've done for May have been great, and I'm loving them. But it does not leave a lot of extra reading time.
No, or even enough reading time for the books we have scheduled.
Yeah, that is also true.
Well, fun fact, Night Watch is actually the first Discworld book that I read.
The first Discworld book that you finished.
Yeah. Can I say that I don't actually like Color of Magic that much? I like it more now that it has some almost nostalgia factor. That's not quite the right word, but I started it in high school and got like maybe halfway through and was like, this is terrible. And then I did not touch Discworld for years until I sneakily asked you what your favorite Discworld book was, which was not the question I should have asked.
No.
Because you said Night Watch, and I was like, guess I'll read that one first.
Night Watch does benefit from a little bit more Discworld context. I think that's true, but it is an absolutely fantastic book.
You know, I think that's really what it is. It's a good book, so I was able to actually read it.
Yeah.
And I became more familiar with Discworld as a whole as I read more of them. But I wouldn't have read more of them if I had tried to read The Color of Magic, as evidenced by the fact that it took me so long to actually read them.
Yes.
And, I mean, this book takes place in the past anyway, so
So chronologically, it's the first Discworld book.
So it's actually fine.
You started where Pratchett intended you to start.
And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Also, I discovered that I am indeed missing a bunch of Discworld books.
This is very distressing.
I thought I was going crazy and that like maybe I had borrowed them from someone or maybe I had never read them. But then when we were rereading them, I was like, oh no, I remember all of this. I've definitely read this before, but I didn't own them. And Nightwatch, I know I own. So this is the first actual proof that there are indeed books missing.
I mean, at least in that sense, it's good to have confirmation that you are missing books because now you know that you need to look for them. So the reason why, and if you are listening to this when we release this episode, and if you're familiar with Discworld, you may notice that this is not the next Discworld book in the series where we are at the moment.
Not in Discworld and not in the City Watch books either.
Yeah, and in no timeline is this the next book that we should be covering. But one of the big dates in this book is the 25th of May. And coincidentally, the 25th of May is a Wednesday this year. So obviously I insisted that we fuck up our schedule, move this to a time where we could release it on the 25th because it had to be. Like it was meant to be.
You know, Sarah, you're actually just being very thematically accurate because this is a book about time travel. Someone travels into the past. Sam Vimes, the main character, travels into the past. We discussed this. It's on the back of the book. I'm allowed to say that.
Yes.
It also fucks up the series a little bit. This book retcons a lot. I'm standing by that.
I disagree with you. I don't think it retcons anything so much as expands upon things. And I feel like my opinion has more weight because I read the book and you didn't.
I've always felt this way. And I have read it, excuse you.
Okay, I meant specifically for this episode.
This book introduces so many things that are apparently vital to Sam Vimes as a human being that we have like 7 books with him that never comes up before. That's a little goofy.
I think it introduces things that Pratchett talks about as being very important to Sam Vimes's development as a human being because he's in the thick of things right now. But that when you get 30 years on, like the events of this book cover all of 3 or 4 days. So really, when you get right down to it, it can't have been that like foundational.
Except the book presents it that way.
Yes, but I think that's because like Vimes is in the middle of it. So he's like full on, nostalgia goggles, like, oh, this was so important to me.
Also, it's a revolution. I feel like I have no frame of reference for how impactful borderline war is to someone.
Yes, but they do talk about how like things like this in Ankh-Morpork happened, quite frequently on a regular basis. Everyone was very skilled at building barriers and barricades because they did it a lot.
Okay. I do think that if Vimes had a mentor, he would have brought it up when mentoring other young City Watchmen.
He had a mentor for 4 days.
If he considers him a mentor, then he can, like, either he does or he doesn't.
I feel like 30 years onward, he wouldn't think about it that much.
Unless you're like in the process of mentoring someone, then it's very relevant. Which he does like a lot, introducing new people to the Watch. That's something adults do all the time. When I was your age, this is how this person trained me.
Yeah, okay, that is true. I will grant you that point.
Yeah.
I will grant you that point.
So that suddenly there's a mentor character that never came up before. But that's fine, because this book is all about fucking with timelines. Including the podcast timeline.
Yes.
Which is what I was trying to say to begin with.
Before we got distracted arguing, as usual.
I think I'm at least right about the mentor thing.
I think you are semi-right about the mentor thing.
This book introduces new things that if, like, clearly Pratchett came up with, like, this wasn't always the idea. Right?
No, I agree with you there. I agree with you that it wasn't always the idea. I don't think it's as much of a retcon as you do. But I mean, it is Like, I don't think that when he developed this character, he had this particular book in mind, like from the very beginning.
No, there's no way. Like, these are new events that just happened to be in the past.
Yes.
Hey, speaking of time travel, how do you section off spoilers when everything has already happened?
I think, actually, serious answer to this question. I think Pratchett does a very good job at hinting at what's going to happen, but not outright saying. And so you can infer, like, you can get a pretty clear idea, but there's that sliver of possibility that what you think is going to happen won't happen because he's fucking up the timeline.
Fucking with the timeline.
Yeah, that's true. He doesn't actually fuck up the timeline, but you think that he could.
Right. I also really loved the in-world explanation for, they don't quite get into multiverse theory, but they kind of do.
Yeah.
There is a world where everything happened the way Sam Vimes remembered it. And then there's also this world where Sam Vimes traveled back in time and fucked with it.
Yeah, I mean, as expected from Terry Pratchett, it's just pretty brilliant.
And it's like the perfect level of hand wavy. It acknowledges that is a logic issue that exists and then says, but fine, right? Cool. Which is very classic Pratchett.
Yeah. He is a master at doing that kind of, you get somewhat of an explanation and then he just hand waves the rest of it away, but it's so good that you don't care that there is no rest of an explanation.
If he didn't attempt an explanation at all, then it would be annoying.
Yeah, you have to have some kind of like attempt made.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be a very thorough one.
I mean, this ain't sci-fi.
And it's Discworld, where, all sorts of weird and wonky things happen.
Speaking of classic Pratchett, there are some A+ puns in this book.
There are some very good puns. I think my favorite, or at least the one that I wrote down, was guilt by association. It comes quite early on in the book, on page 5 of my copy anyway. He's talking about how now that he is commander of the City Watch, Sir Samuel Vimes, he has a ceremonial uniform that's basically, completely impractical. Lots of plumes and gold decoration and things like that. Sam Vimes felt like a class traitor every time he wore it. He hated being thought of as one of those people that wore stupid ornamental armor. It was guilt by association. And that's just like some A+ wordplay from Pratchett. It's excellent. This book is excellent. This book makes me so happy. I mean, it's like I said, it's the book that I've read the most out of all of the Discworld books. And there's something just so comforting about this book, probably just because I've read it over and over and over. And I wouldn't actually call it like the happiest of Discworld books.
No, it's pretty.
It's dark.
It's dark and it's very like not introspective, but very thoughtful.
Yeah.
About some pretty serious topics.
Yeah. I mean, like, there's a lot of commentary on wealth and privilege and things like that in this book. More so, I would say, than normal even, which says something because there's a lot of that commentary in his other books too.
Well, he has to have that commentary. Pratchett has to have that commentary in the City Watch books because you cannot have a book about a cop where the cop is like totally part of the establishment like that. You can't. No, you can't do that. You have to have the rebel cop. Otherwise, I don't think it would be enjoyable.
No, not at all.
No. So by having Vimes be this sort of a man of the people,
anti-establishment,
very much so, he clashes with the leaders of Ankh-Morpork constantly, including his now quote unquote peers in the because he marries into nobility, right? She's technically a landed lady. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, he is the wealthiest man in Ankh-Morpork at the start of the book, pre going back in time.
Well, and at the start of this book, not at the start of the series.
Yes.
I will say that was probably the only aspect of this book that I totally missed out on the first time I read it. His relationship with Sybil, in this book, his wife, it has such little screen time because this book happens entirely in the past before he's even met her, almost entirely. So she's in there a little bit, but hardly any at all. And now that I have read other City Watch books and I've actually seen them meet and their relationship grow, and I've seen them, I mean, they've gone on adventures together. They've fought dragons together. That's very cool. The character of Sybil and also their relationship is so much more meaningful to me now.
I think it also, there's a point that I want to make in the spoiler section. So I'm going to kind of dance around it here. But I think that it makes this one particular moment near the end of the book that much more poignant when you know how his relationship with Sybil has developed and grown. And when you actually care for Sybil as a person, and you don't get that if you're coming into this book without having read any of the other City Watch books.
Which is maybe ironic. Am I using that word correctly? That none of the City Watch stuff in this book needs the City Watch books to have been read. It's the romance plotline that I need the other City Watch books for background.
Yeah. That is kind of funny.
Because all of the Watch stuff, I think, is pretty self-explanatory here. I mean, it all happens in the past. None of the other ones have actually happened yet. I mean, for the Sam Vimes of the current timeline, they have, but you don't need them to understand what's going on in the revolution because, like I said, that hadn't happened. It hadn't been written yet.
I think it helps a little bit to have some fondness for like Colin and Nobby.
Yeah.
But you don't need that.
No, I don't think so. Because I mean, they're still charming.
Like, obviously, you will still like Colin and Nobby in this book if you don't know them. But I think that it is fun to come to them with that fondness from previous books and think this is what they were like when they were younger.
I mean, absolutely.
Yeah.
Having that background adds a dimension to their characters, 100%.
Yes, but it's not necessary in order to enjoy the book.
No.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't think it's necessary to understand who Sybil is to enjoy the book, but it's necessary to know who Sybil is to understand how meaningful those scenes with her are.
Yes.
I think as a reader, I definitely missed out on those moments with her. Whereas, yeah, I mean, maybe I could have known more about Knobs, but he's knobbing Knobs. It was fine.
Yeah, I don't think you miss out on anything in those scenes if you come to it without having read any other of the books.
I really wanted to make a food metaphor, but I restrained myself.
I'm very impressed by your restraint.
But as mentioned like a moment ago, how long ago was that? We had to break for pug noises.
And we also kind of got on a tangent.
But we were talking about how Vimes really needs to be the man of the people, anti-establishment officer. Otherwise, reading about his adventures would not be enjoyable or fun at all in any way.
Agreed.
But because of that, we get some really incredible commentary on wealth and privilege, which there's, of course, the famous line, the Sam Vimes Boots theory of economics.
Yeah.
Which is not in this book, but it very well illustrates what he as a character is like.
And he does, I mean, he doesn't name that theory by name in this book, but he does talk about boots and how much he likes the cheap boots because he can read the street cobbles and tell where he is through his soles.
But there's also several moments where he deals with, I mean, as a police officer in Ankh-Morpork, which is not a real place, but he still is very much hands-on, experiencing the disparity between the upper class and the lower class. He himself having moved up in the classes very rapidly.
Especially in this book in particular, where like the Ankh-Morpork that we know from the previous books is much more egalitarian. And this book is much more divided along those class lines, with the wealthy, being able to do whatever they want. He has a very good quote about it. Yes, thought Vimes, that's the way it was. Privilege, which just means private law. Two types of people laugh at the law, those that break it and those that make it. And then he goes on to say, well, it's not like that now, but I'm not in the now.
Yeah. Well, and that's also maybe part of why this really horrifying look at law enforcement doesn't hit as hard, because we know it changes. If Ankh-Morpork was like that in all of the books in the quote unquote present day, it would be miserable, because unequal law enforcement is miserable. But because this is set in the past, we know it doesn't last. It's not as stressful to read about this really terrible system.
Yeah, I think that the fact that it does change, we know it changes, really helps counterbalance the very dark sides of it that we see in this book, in this time in particular.
Vimes has a couple of other quotes that you pulled out. Thank you for reading the book, Sarah.
You're welcome. I mean, I would have read it anyway. Regardless of how busy our May is, this is the one book that I would have stayed up all night just so that I could have read it, because it's my tradition at this point. I've been doing it for the last 7 years, ever since he passed away.
I would have at least made an attempt if I could have found my copy.
That's fair. I do know where my 3 copies of this book are.
3? Did you take mine?
No, because you would have a paperback.
You are holding a paperback. Is that my book?
I am holding a paperback. This is...
It's not my book. No, I write my name all over my books.
It is not your book. I know this is not your book. I think this is a US version. Yeah, a US edition. Getting off that tangent again. The other quote that I pulled out was Sam Vimes is talking to young Sam Vimes, who has just started working as a night watchman and has been learning from some very corrupt senior officers, one of whom, when they were out doing their rounds, was like, it's okay to take this bribe. I'll take $4, you take $1. That's just how the night watch works. This is just perks of the job. And so old Sam Vimes is talking to his younger self. Hard to explain to a kid like Sam why pouncing $1 when you got the chance was a bad thing to do. Editorial note from me, not from the book, because, the city is pretty shitty right now. Put it like this, Lance Constable, he said as they turned the corner. Would you let a murderer off for $1,000? No, sir. $1,000 would set your mom up in a nice place in a good part of town, though. Knock it off, Sarge. I'm not like that. You were when you took that $1. Everything else is just a haggling over the price, which I thought was a very powerful quote.
It is. And it reminds me of the saying that in a system where the consequence for crime is a fine, you're really just saying that the rich are allowed to do crime.
Mm-hmm. And that goes very well with his previous quote about there being 2 different kinds of law,
Oh, exactly.
One for the rich and one for the poor. Privilege, which just means private law.
And bribery isn't the same thing as just being able to throw cash at fines, but it's almost the same thing.
I mean, I think especially in Ankh-Morpork, it's the same thing. Maybe real world application is a little different, but
maybe. I think the privilege quote also has the layer of being able to afford a really good lawyer,
mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just avoiding the law system. It's also being able to navigate it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And having the resources to do so. And yeah, this book brings up so many extremely poignant, even still, maybe sadly.
That was a book that came out in 2002, still so relevant.
That's 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's 20 years ago.
And yet the quote about protests and riots feels like it was written yesterday.
It really does. I think that's partly why I noted it. So, as we've mentioned, there's a lot of civil unrest in Ankh-Morpork right now. And there are both protests and riots. And Vimes is talking to the captain at his watch house, who says, "The riot was over the price of bread, I understand." "No, the protest was over the price of bread," said Vimes's inner voice. "The riot was what happens when you have panicking people trapped between idiots on horseback and other idiots shouting, 'Yeah, right,' and trying to push forward, and the whole thing in the charge of a fool advised by a maniac with a steel rule." And I think that does a very good job at differentiating between riot and protest and the causes.
Yeah. There's so much of this book, too. I'm trying to figure out how much of this is spoiler talk. That is what it would be like to mentor yourself.
I mean, yes.
I mean, obviously, that's literally the plot of the book. But it makes you think, right? I don't know. One's younger self.
I mean, it does, and it does specifically talk about that and how, like, your younger self is a twerp, but you have to be, in order to be who you are today, you have to go through that period of twerpitude, of twerphood, and that you then was what you had to be to start out on the rocky road of becoming you now. And one of the rocky patches on that road was being a twerp. A much better dream, one that'd ensure sounder sleep, was not to know now what you didn't know then. Which, yeah, if you don't grow, then you don't have to reflect, and, you know, that's all gravy.
You'll never be embarrassed by your past actions because you're still doing them. I mean, obviously not the better path, but there is a charm to that idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the better path, but I can understand the appeal.
It's funny to think about. But I just mean the idealism between being able to turn yourself into the person you want to be in a very literal, hands-on way, and Vimes also having been part of this revolution, you know, for the city and for himself at the same time. It's a very introspective book. And is outrospective a word?
It is now.
Retrospective? Maybe that's the word I'll use. There's a spective word that applies.
It is all kinds of spective.
Yes. One might even call it speculative.
My next point is just veterinary in all caps.
And then your sub point is also in all caps.
Yes, I love veterinary so much.
Those were the points.
those were my points. Veterinary does show up in this book in the past. He's not in huge scenes, or he's not in scenes a lot.
Very important ones, but very small ones page-wise.
Well, some of them are important. Some of them are less important for the plot of the book.
You just described how books work.
Okay, fair. This is true. But maybe it's because I first read this book at 14 or so. And veterinary, I think, is 16 or 18 or so. And he is exactly the kind of character that I go for, like a cool assassin who's not bothered by anything. So, of course.
A little bit edgy.
And a little bit edgy. I mean, I feel like that kind of comes with the territory of being an assassin.
Yeah, I just needed to call it out specifically.
Yes.
You're right, it was redundant.
But so I had the hugest crush on young veterinary. I still have a huge crush on young veterinary. I love him so much.
Yeah, but now that's gross.
I know.
He's 18, Sarah.
I know. He's not 18 in my mind. It's young veterinary, but grown up.
Wait, can I take that sound clip out of context forever? No, I mean, you're right. He's great.
He is.
I also think it's weird going back and reading the earlier books where he starts appearing, because he is not nearly as cool as he is.
His character goes through some drastic like coolness growth.
Yeah. And so going back and reading the early ones, you're like, oh, yeah, it's veterinary. But he does not warrant that emotion at all.
Like he gets turned into a lizard in one of the very early books, which I always forget about. I'm like, wow, you veterinary, your standards have lowered.
Yeah. I mean, poor guy getting turned into a lizard.
I mean, yeah.
I feel like the veterinary in later books would have like an anti-lizard charm just conveniently tucked away.
I think the veterinary in later books would have like known that it was going to happen and not been there to get turned into a lizard in the first place.
Or we would then see lizard veterinary doing a bunch of paperwork and like not giving a shit at all.
That would have been good too.
Like I could see him just rolling with it.
Yeah.
Like water off of a patrician lizard's back.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And this is the book where we finally see him starting to justify those warm feelings.
Yes. This is very, very specifically the book that engendered in me all of those warm feelings. This is where I can trace my warm and fuzzies for veterinary back to this book.
I mean, he is a pretty badass dude in other books, but not as charming. A little more sinister is not quite the right word, but you know what I'm saying.
He is badass in the other books, but
some of the other books.
in some of the other books. But 14-year-old Sarah would not have cared about him so much if she hadn't seen 18-year-old him.
Well, that's true.
30-year-old Sarah would probably, have different thoughts if I was coming to the book fresh.
I feel like I've teased you enough, so I'm going to stop.
I mean, that's fine. I deserve teasing for my feelings for veterinary.
Yeah, but sufficient teasing has been enacted upon you.
Okay.
You deserve some. You don't deserve infinite.
Okay.
Fine.
I
am reasonable.
That.
I'm growing. Not a twerp anymore. Thanks, Sam Vimes. Sometimes I'm a twerp, but I'm not being one right now.
I appreciate that.
Well, I think we're getting to the point where we ask ourselves, when should you read this book? And I think, Sarah, you're going to try to convince me that I read it at the wrong time.
No, I'm not going to say that you read it at the wrong time. I will say that this wouldn't be the book that I recommend as a first book, but you could do worse as your first Discworld book.
Yeah. That whole conversation, right? What book do you start with in Discworld? It's so interesting because it really boils down to you read the one that you're going to enjoy. Mm-hmm. But how do you figure that out? And then how do you balance how much backstory you need to actually appreciate the book? And I would say, despite this being so far into the City Watch mini-series of Discworld, you don't need that much backstory to appreciate it. Sybil, you do, but she's not even in it that much.
Yeah, I mean, I think regardless of how much I love it, this is one of my absolute favorite Discworld books. If you are only going to read one Discworld book, I don't think it should be this one.
No, that would be Small Gods or Monstrous Regiment.
Yeah, I was just going to say, or Monstrous Regiment.
I think that just depends on whether you want to poke fun at religion or whether you want to poke fun at misogyny between those two.
Yeah. But
not the worst book to start with, but probably not the best one either.
Yeah, like it's not, like you say, it's not the worst book to start with. You will enjoy it without having read any of the other books. Maybe there will be some nuance that is lost on you, but nothing that will really impede your ability to read and enjoy the book. But there are better books to start off with, I think.
I think you're probably right.
But it is one of my absolute favorite Discworld books. And of course, I mean, the 25th of May is just such a, I don't know, it has such a not impact, but it's one of the big Discworld days in the fandom. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I should mention here that if you are a fan of Discworld and want to celebrate Terry Pratchett and the books, you could do worse than by donating to an Alzheimer's research Foundation on the 25th to support Alzheimer's research.
Yeah, I think that's a very sweet sort of memorial to him.
Mm-hmm. I would rather celebrate his life on the 25th of May than celebrate his death on March 12th or whenever he actually died.
Well,
if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, celebrating someone's death is a weird sentence.
I don't mean celebrate his death.
Memorialize him.
Yeah.
I got you.
Yeah.
Okay, I lied. I am going to make fun of you a little bit.
Is it still for veterinary for anything else?
No, for that just now.
Okay.
I already did it.
Okay.
To avoid spoilers, skip to 45:05.
I don't know if it's because I've read this book so often or not. Actually, I feel like it's probably not, because reading this book so often should lessen the impact.
Yeah, you'd think.
But this book still gives me chills when I read some of the foreshadowing, possibly because like Pratchett does it so well, specifically in regards to how Vimes, or Keel, which is the mentor that he replaces in time, and the revolutionaries who stood with him are all going to die at the end of the book. But he doesn't actually come out and say it till very far into the book.
Mm-hmm.
And just the way that he talks about it and hints at it is so good. I also do still cry at the end of this book. I mean, I cry at the drop of a hat, so that's not really saying much.
I think you can catch on what's coming. Like,
yeah,
it's not going to be a happy ending. It's not an unhappy ending either. You know what I mean?
Bittersweet. It's not a surprise what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's not trying to hide it, but he is not. Again, he's not coming out and saying it outright for a long time.
And Vimes knows. At least he knows what happened in his timeline.
Yeah.
And even though he does change some of the circumstances.
Yeah, he changes individual things, but he doesn't change the overall timeline.
No. And there's a quote about that you have written down. I don't have a book, so I can't look it up.
There is a quote about that, although it's not exactly about that. Let me get to the page.
I keep looking at my bookshelf like it will magically appear.
You just missed it. All of the other times that you looked at that shelf.
I mean, you joke, but that's very possible.
You got to organize your books.
I only looked 3 times. It could be there.
It could. I'm assuming, for the quote, you were talking about History Finds a Way.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is more kind of Vimes' eulogy for the dead than specifically about how he could change individual details and not, the big picture. But history finds a way. The nature of events changed, but the nature of the dead had not. It had been a mean, shameful little fight that ended them, a fly-specked footnote of history, but they hadn't been mean or shameful men. They hadn't run, and they could have run with honor. They'd stayed, and he wondered if the path had seemed as clear to them then as it did to him now. They'd stayed not because they wanted to be heroes, but because they chose to think of it as their job, and it was in front of them.
And I mean, I think that's a statement on, even though Vimes was able to shift some circumstances, the people in those circumstances were still ones who were going to take danger upon themselves because they believed that's what was right.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, he wouldn't have wanted to change that.
Yeah, I mean, he is saying like this was their character and this would have been their character even had I not been here to change things.
I mean, he bought them a little time, right?
Not really. A couple of hours, maybe. I think they die technically in his original timeline. I think they die a couple of hours before they actually die.
That's a little bit of time.
It's not a lot of time.
A very small amount of time.
It is a minuscule amount of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think one of the things about this book that it really clearly shows about Vimes is how much he cares for people and like the core of his character, because he talks about at one point, like how he wants to go. And this is specifically the scene that I was referring to in the non-spoiler section, where knowing the background of his relationship with Sybil really increases the impact and poignancy of this scene, because he's talking about he wanted to go home. He wanted it so much that he trembled at the thought. But if the price of that was selling good men to the night, if the price was filling those graves, if the price was not fighting with every trick he knew, then it was too high. It wasn't a decision he was making. He knew that. It happened far below the levels of the brain where decisions were made. It was something built in. There was no universe anywhere where Sam Vimes would give in on this, because if he did, then he wouldn't be Sam Vimes anymore.
Which is funny because he's Keel at that moment. He's not Sam Vimes.
He is not Sam Vimes. But I think it speaks to who he is as a person, that he would give up his future. He would give up his wife and his unborn child if it meant saving people today.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's another element to the sort of cyclical, him basically raising himself, or at least not raising. That implies an earlier stage of development, I think.
And a longer stage of development.
But he was clearly an extremely influential person. Keel was clearly an extremely influential person for young Sam Vimes. I mean, if he was a dirty cop who took bribes before, and then after he wasn't a dirty cop who took bribes. He was an inexperienced cop who didn't have anyone to tell him that taking bribes is bad, actually. I mean, do you need someone to tell you that bribery isn't great?
In Ankh-Morpork at that time? Probably.
Yeah. And so without Keel, he wouldn't have learned that. Likely. He might have found someone else later. But the way it shook out, Keel was the person who changed him, who taught him those morals that are so integral to who he is throughout various time jumping shenanigans. And what I was trying to say is that we get Vimes, sort of shaping his younger self, which gets an added depth to it because he's also sort of struggling with the birth of his first child and becoming a father and having to raise and shape a human being. And okay, that's not the same thing as a 3-day zeitgeist of, wait, no, don't be a shithead. And I didn't know if him having a kid was a spoiler. Does that come up before he goes back in time?
It does.
Okay.
Yeah, it does come up before he goes back in time.
It's just an added element to that whole situation.
Are we going to add Where Is My Cow to our Discworld list of episodes?
I own it, so yes.
Do you really?
Yeah.
I don't own it.
Really? You're not missing out on that much.
I mean, I've read it.
Yeah. See, I can see that one. I know where that one is. Where Is My Cow is the children's book that Sam Vimes reads to his very young child, or the story he tells to his young child, because he comes up with a story, right?
I don't think that it's actually a book that he reads. I think it's the story that he tells.
I mean, we were able to talk about a lot of this book without giving spoilers because, again, the book spoils itself. That's not how spoilers work.
No, but this is a book where, like, knowing the end isn't a spoiler because it's the journey. We've said this before about, what was it? I think Lords and Ladies. So many of Pratchett's books pull really heavily on existing narratives that how it's going to end anyway. And this is not an example of one of those books. I mean, it's not like a character for character recreation of a Shakespeare play or something. But just the nature of the story. Vimes knows what's going to happen the whole time. So even though he doesn't come out and tell the character, by the way he acts in the book, you can sort of gather that it's not great. I mean, it starts with the memorial for the event that he then goes back and re-experiences. If that doesn't tell you it's not great, I don't know. It doesn't start with the memorial for it.
It doesn't?
No.
Is it more memorial afterwards?
The memorial's kind of a memorial is at the end.
The annual going to the
Yeah, that's a
temple. Okay.
I guess I know actually that's true. They do go to the cemetery in the beginning.
I thought so. Like, you know,
They
someone
do.
dies.
Yeah.
And you think maybe he'll change it, but you know that's a possibility right from the beginning.
Yeah.
Well, we talked about puns earlier. I don't know if they count if they're in Latin, but I think they do.
I think they count.
It's just an extra pretentious layer to the pun.
Yes, which is kind of the point.
I guess it's not a pun, though. That's not the definition. It's not wordplay. It's let's turn these common phrases into Latin and be faux pretentious or over the top pretentious. It's the Latin that is faux, not the pretentiousness.
Yes.
For example, fabricati diem, punk.
I feel like that's self-explanatory, but it is, in fact, make my day, punk.
I have not seen Dirty Harry with Clint Eastwood, but I am familiar with that line.
Yeah, neither have I, but I feel like that line has progressed into the collective consciousness.
Also, punk is fun to say.
It is.
All right, do I break out my 2 semesters of Latin for this next one?
Yes, because all of my Latin sounds like I'm speaking it with a French accent because I learned it in France.
Ave, duci novo, similis duci Seneca, and Ave, bossa nova, similis bossa Seneca.
Meet the new boss, same as the old boss.
Ah, yes, the great philosophers, the Who.
It's funny how things sound fancy when you say them in Latin, despite the origin. I mean, I know that is the joke, but...
Also, to defend myself before anyone says anything, I took classic Latin, not church Latin. So I did pronounce things the way I learned, which is not the way most people pronounce Latin. Different dialect, that's all.
You did great.
I did do great, but only for people who learn classical Latin and not church Latin. Yeah, it's fun. It's really on brand for Pratchett to put extremely, we already used the word common, familiar, non-highfalutin, low-falutin phrases.
Well, I feel like that's one of the things that makes Discworld such a relatable series is that it has all of these references that ground it in the real world, even though it is this wild fantasy world.
And I mean, at least in these cases, by adding that sort of layer of translating it into faux Latin, it makes it less jarring to go, wait, that's a Clint Eastwood quote. It makes it just a little bit mysterious, a little bit separated from the familiar, which makes it easier to integrate into the goofiness that is Discworld.
It's just this added layer.
Mm-hmm. Also, I do like punk. For a little bit of context, Make My Day Punk is the motto of the City Watch, I believe.
I don't think it's actually the motto.
Okay, well, when we were looking up the Latin phrases in Night Watch, which we Googled instead of taking notes like we should have, I believe that was the context given. And then, of course, meet the new boss, same as the old boss, comes up after the revolution when things didn't change all that much.
Yeah. And that is a Latin phrase that I do remember from the book. Specifically, like I remember the context.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily remember the context of Make My Day Punk.
It's definitely related to the Watch. Maybe it wasn't their motto. I thought it was.
I couldn't say either way.
This is from the fandom wiki. The Watch's current motto is Fabricati diem, punk. This is nonsense in Latin and doesn't actually mean make my day, punk, although it looks as though it ought to. This is the nature of most of the Latin in the books and not unusual. However, Fred Colin insists that it means to protect and serve.
I do like that.
That does sound like something Colin would say.
It does.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Fiction Fans.
Come disagree with us. We're on Twitter and Instagram at FictionFansPod. You can also email us at fictionfanspod@gmail.com.
If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and follow us wherever your podcasts live.
You should also, in memory of Terry Pratchett, make a donation to your Alzheimer's Research Foundation of choice. If you want to support us, our Linktree also has a link to our Patreon, where you can support us and find our show notes and a lot of other nonsense.
Disclaimer: Fiction Fans does no Alzheimer's research.
Yes, if you are choosing between supporting us and donating to an Alzheimer's Research Foundation, please donate to the Research Foundation, because we will not be doing any Alzheimer's research.
Thanks again for listening, and may your villains always be defeated. Bye.
Bye.